Today we'll talk about the urinary system, specifically part 1 of the urinary system. In part 1 we'll discuss the functions of the urinary system and the anatomy of the kidneys. So let's get started. So what are the functions of the urinary system? Well, the urinary system filters waste from the blood plasma and excretes that waste through urine. Think of the urinary system as a filter of our body. So let's talk about the functions of the kidneys. So the kidneys filter waste from the blood plasma, regulate blood volume, blood pressure, and osmolarity through the regulation of water output. They also regulate electrolyte and acid-base balance of body fluids, secrete the hormone erythropoietin, which stimulate red blood cell growth and development. They also regulate calcium homeostasis, detoxify free radicals, and in extreme starvation they help support blood glucose levels by synthesizing glucose from amino acids. So let's talk about nitrogenous wastes. What are nitrogenous wastes? Well, nitrogenous wastes are nitrogen-based wastes that are produced by the body as a byproduct from protein catabolism. Nitrogenous wastes are the subject of metabolic waste, which are waste substances that are produced by the body. So let's talk about the nitrogenous waste and move on over to the ThinkPad. To understand nitrogenous waste, let's draw ourselves a liver. Doesn't have to be the best liver, just draw yourself a liver. And draw yourself some protein. Think this is protein. Now protein will react with water to produce amino acids represented by these red dots. Now this reaction produces ammonia, which is very toxic for the body. So the liver quickly converts ammonia into urea, which is less toxic but still needs to be excreted from the body. Other nitrogenous wastes include, as we talked about, ammonia, urea. We also have uric acid, and creatinine, which has 4 carbon, 7 hydrogen, 3 nitrogen, and 1 oxygen. Creatinine. So there you go. Those are the basic nitrogenous wastes that we have in our body. The level of nitrogenous waste in the blood is shown by the blood urea nitrogen test, or BUN test for short. This test also shows the functions of the kidneys. An elevated BUN can signify azotemia, which can progress to renal failure. So let's talk about excretion. What is excretion? Well, excretion is a process of separating waste from body fluids and eliminating them. There are 4 organ systems that do this. The respiratory system excretes carbon dioxide, other gases, and water every time we exhale. The integumentary system excretes water, inorganic salts, lactic acid, and urea through sweat. The digestive system eliminates food residue, excretes water, salt, carbon dioxide, etc. through feces. And the urinary system excretes metabolic waste, toxins, drugs, hormones, salts, hydrogen ions, and water through urine. So now let's talk about the anatomy of the kidneys. So for the anatomy of the urinary system, we have 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, and 1 urethra. So in total, urine is transported from the kidneys to the ureters all the way to the bladder and is excreted from the body through the urethra. We'll start by the outermost layer. The outermost layer of the kidney is called the fibrous capsule. Fibrous capsule protects the kidney from trauma, basically the eggshell of the egg. Next we have the renal cortex. The renal cortex is always above the renal medulla. Now the extensions of the renal cortex, which separate each renal medulla, are called the renal columns. Renal columns. Now after the renal cortex, we have the renal medulla. The renal medulla will always have a higher osmolarity than the renal cortex. We'll talk about osmolarity throughout the video. Now, the renal medulla is sort of like a pyramid shape, and the pyramid shape is what we call the renal pyramid. Renal pyramid. Now, where the renal pyramid ends is called the renal papilla. This is where the collecting duct drains all the urine. Renal papilla. Now, after the renal papilla, urine is excreted into the minor renal calyx, or it's just called minor calyx. After minor calyx, there's obviously a major calyx. Major calyx, as the name says, is much bigger. Major calyx. Now after the major calyx comes the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis. And after the renal pelvis, you might already know, comes the ureters, or specifically the ureter for now. Over here, they're just renal blood vessels. Renal blood vessels. And over here is the renal sinus. The renal sinus is occupied by blood vessels, nerves, etc. Renal sinus. There you go. That's the basic anatomy of the kidney. So this picture represents the basic anatomy of all the blood vessels associated with the kidneys. Now it starts from the aorta, and it goes all the way down to the renal artery. Renal artery is right over here. Now after the renal artery, the arteries break down into the segmental artery. Segmental arteries, which are basically the segments. After the segmental artery comes the interlobar artery. Interlobar artery. Each interlobar artery penetrates the renal column over here. Now after the interlobar artery comes the arcuate artery. Arcuate artery. These arteries basically surround the renal medulla, and then they break down and more into the cortical radiate artery. Cortical radiate artery. Now after the cortical radiate artery, the artery becomes an afferent arteriole. This is a nephron-associated blood vessel, and that afferent arteriole goes through the glomerulus and becomes an efferent arteriole. Now after the efferent arteriole, the arteriole breaks down into the peritubular capillaries or vasorecta. The vasorecta is much more different than the peritubular capillaries. The vasorecta brings oxygen to the renal medulla. Now after the peritubular capillaries or vasorecta, it just starts the process all over again from cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, renal vein, coming all the way out to the renal vein, and then finally the inferior vena cava. This picture shows the relative location of the kidney. The kidney is closer to the back and the spinal cord. Now there are three layers that protect the kidney. The first one includes the renal fascia. The renal fascia basically holds the kidney together and it is fused to the peritoneum. This binds the kidney and other organs together, and the peritoneum does that. The next layer is the pararenal fat capsule. The pararenal fat capsule is a layer of adipose tissue that cushions the kidney. The next layer is the fibrous capsule. As we talked before, the fibrous capsule encloses the kidney like a wrapper and protects it from trauma and infection. So this picture shows us a zoomed in view of the cortex and the medulla. So we'll start by the cortical nephron. The cortical nephron is much different from the juxtamedullary nephron in that it's closer to the kidney surface and has a shorter nephron loop compared to the juxtamedullary nephron, which is closer to the medulla and has a longer nephron loop. Now, as we discussed about the blood vessels of the kidney, starts by the arcuate artery, then splits to the interlobar artery, afferent arterial, glomerulus, efferent arterial, and peritubular capillaries or vasa recta, then goes to the interlobar vein, arcuate artery, and then out. Where the arcuate artery and the arcuate vein reside is called the corticomedullary junction. Now let's talk more about the nephron. After the glomerulus comes the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT for short. After the proximal convoluted tubule comes a nephron loop, specifically the descending limb of the nephron loop, then the ascending limb of the nephron loop. The nephron loop is also referred to as loop of Henle. After the nephron loop comes the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT for short. After the distal convoluted tubule comes a collecting duct. And that's all. This picture is a picture of the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus. The glomerular capsule consists of parietal layer, capsular space, and podocytes of the visceral layer. The glomerulus accounts for the inside of the glomerular capsule, right over here. And in the glomerulus consists of glomerular capillaries. Now there are two opposite sides of the renal corpuscle. There's a vascular pole, which consists of the afferent arterial and the efferent arterial, and the urinary pole, which gives rise to the renal tubule, starting from the proximal convoluted tubule. Now notice that the afferent arterial is larger than the efferent arterial. We'll talk about why this is later. So that is the end of part 1 of the urinary system. In part 1, we discussed the functions of the urinary system and the anatomy of the kidneys.